Good morning, everyone. My name's Carmel Martin, and I'm the Executive Vice President for Policy here at CAP. Thank you for joining us for this critically important conversation on improving unemployment protections in our nation. I'd also like to thank our partners, the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality and the National Employment Law Project, for co-hosting today's event with CAP and for all of the work they do to promote economic security for all families. At some point in their working years, 2 out of every 3 Americans will experience at least 1 year of unemployment for themselves or the head of their household. As the tens of millions of Americans who lost their jobs during the Great Recession will tell you, unemployment can be extremely painful for families. It also has enormous costs for our economy, hampering growth and eroding the skills of our workforce. Unemployment insurance, or UI, was created to minimize the risks and hardships of job loss. In 2009 alone, UI kept more than 5 million Americans out of poverty and saved more than 2 million jobs by boosting demand. But the system hasn't adjusted to dramatic changes in America's workforce and economy. Globalization and technological change mean that many laid-off workers will need to retrain in new sectors. Yet UI's reemployment services are sorely underfunded. Women are now primary breadwinners in 40% of families with children, a 4-fold increase since 1960. Yet fewer women qualify for UI because they are more likely to work part-time, have caregiving responsibilities, or face low wages or erratic schedules. And a growing share of the workforce, nearly 16% in 2015, is in an alternative work arrangement, including gig economy workers and independent contractors. Yet these workers are systematically excluded. Worse, many states have made cuts to their UI programs in recent years. As a result, only about 1 in 4 unemployed workers receive UI in recent years, the lowest in the program's history. The new proposal we're discussing today lays out a comprehensive roadmap for reversing these shortcomings, and it includes a job seekers allowance which would extend job search assistance to returning caregivers, independent contractors, younger workers with more limited work history, and gig economy workers. Shoring up and expanding critical unemployment protections must be a priority for a new Congress and administration. And we hope that today's conversation will invigorate and inform those critical preparations. We're lucky to be joined this morning by 2 of our nation's most important thought leaders and advocates for a strong unemployment protection system, Congressman Sandy Levin and Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Jason Furman. We'll hear first from Congressman Levin, who represents Michigan's 9th Congressional District. For more than 3 decades, Representative Levin has been a tireless champion on behalf of working families and was one of the key architects of reforms that enabled UI to be such an important part of our country's response to the Great Recession. And as the ranking member of the House Ways and Means Committee, he has continued to be a fierce proponent of strengthening and modernizing unemployment insurance. So please join me in welcoming Congressman Levin to the podium.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here with CAP, with Georgetown, with NELP, and with Jason Furman. Looking back some years ago, this was such a pressing issue, and it tends to have been forgotten. Just the agony there was for millions of people in this country, and the controversy that often did beset this program. And so I want to just say briefly why it's so vital that we're here today. First of all, as mentioned, what this program meant for people in our society. I used to call back home to Michigan sometimes every week to see what was going on. For example, in the construction industry in southeast Michigan, when often there would just be, as they said, a couple hundred people on the bench. In many of the trades, most of them, there would be thousands of people out of work. And the impact this had on the lives and the way that this prevented people from falling into poverty, 11 million. Also what it meant to the economy, where we would have been, and Jason Furman's going to talk about this, without the impetus that came from the unemployment insurance program. So that's the first reason I think it's so important that we be here. Secondly, the present structure is a mess. You covered some of the inadequacies of the program. Only a quarter of the people covered, and that's likely to become even more so if we don't change it. And also the problems with the state system and the number of states that are deeply in debt. I mean, I read this and I had to reread it again. 3 states have $3.4 billion in debt? 3 states? And the state of Michigan has been going in the opposite direction. And what it did some time ago was to cut the minimum benefit from 26 to 20 weeks. And also, I think it's important because there'll be another recession. So I just want to close by saying what I think this proposal will really mean. I think it will open up the debate once again about what unemployment insurance really is. People who are employed think they work for their unemployment insurance, that it's paid for in part by the employer in lieu of wages. They think they earned this. And yet, when we had the battle over long-term unemployment insurance, there was a feeling that it was a disincentive and that it was a kind of a welfare program. And so I remember a report being issued in November of 2013, and it said this: this program, which has already added too much to the deficit and helped keep unemployment too high for too long, should be allowed to finally come to an end. So we need to have this debate once again. I remember 2 of us going down Christmas Eve, to urge there be an extension of unemployment insurance for the long-term unemployed. And we failed. And Jason Furman is going to also, I know, touch on how much the lack of unemployment insurance essentially leads to people dropping out of the workforce. So we have every reason to be here today. And my hope is that this proposal, plus that of the administration's, will once again foster a debate, because we talk about today the disenchantment of people with government. And I think one of the reasons people feel that way is they worked hard, they're laid off through no fault of their own. It may be because of what happened in Japan or China. They're looking for work. They can't find it. And essentially, the message to them is tough luck. And this country cannot operate on the basis of tough luck. It won't work. So I guess Jason Furman's now going to take over. I want everybody, as he comes forth, to understand the dedication that he provided and the agony with which he and I and others went through virtually every day as we struggled to maintain, to sustain a program that helped people from falling through the cracks, helped them keep their spirits, and helped them continue to look for work when so many of them had never done anything but worked all their lives. And NELP, we would call you, and there were so many people who would tell us at the age of 18 they went to work. They had worked all their lives. The worst recession since the Great Depression came, and they were out in the street. This country must do better, and I pay tribute to all of you who have come today to join in this effort that has to be renewed soon. Thank you very much.
So thanks so much for those kind words. Sandy and I used to speak every single day, often multiple times a day, about this issue. And I'm really glad we're talking today. It's something organized by CAP, NELP, and the Georgetown Center, which couldn't be a more timely conversation. And it couldn't be more timely because the labor market is strong today, which is precisely when we should be having this discussion, not when we normally have it, which in the bad case is a week before benefits expire, and in the worst case is a week after benefits has expired, both of which we've done in recent years. I wanted to provide some broad economic context that motivates the reforms, talk about some of the economic benefits of UI, and then talk about some of the ways in which the current system could be strengthened. And I'll present proposals that the President put forward this year. But notably, these proposals have a lot in common with the proposals in the new report by CAP, NELP, and the Georgetown Center. And I think the most important thing is not even any of the specifics, but making sure that we're all having a conversation both about some of the ideas I'll be talking about, but also by other thought-provoking ideas in the report, like the job seekers allowance, which merits further discussion and consideration. To start, though, with three economic problems that I worry about every day and that UI reform currently plays a role in helping with and can play an even better role, wanted to begin with number one, which is the decline in the labor force participation rate. The Council of Economic Advisors put out a major report on this topic 2 weeks ago. And the basic upshot of it is labor force participation for decades was rising because women were entering the workforce. But starting around 2000, that process ended. The process of prime-age men withdrawing from the labor force, which began in the 1950s, continued, and all of that has since been exacerbated by the aging of the population and the Great Recession. So all of that is combined to put us on a downward trajectory in terms of labor force participation, and a trajectory that I would be worried about that would continue going forward unless we take steps. One thing we point out in our report is if you look in international context, the United States actually has lower labor force participation rate for prime age, both men and women, than many other countries. And that's notable because our unemployment insurance system, like the rest of our social safety net, is considerably less generous than other countries. So I don't think you can blame it on our system. In fact, precisely the opposite. We need labor markets that aren't just flexible, but also are supportive and help people find jobs, something I'll come back to in the context of UI, but is an important broader discussion. The second issue is our ability to respond to future recessions. And the two main policy tools we have are fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy does not, in my judgment, face an economic constraint on its use, but unfortunately may face some political constraints in terms of its timely use. Monetary policy, because we've had real interest rates which have been declining for decades and across a range of countries and were low even before the Great Recession, have less scope for interest rate reductions than we've had in the past, and thus less room for conventional monetary policy to respond for recessions, which makes the improvement of automatic stabilizers all the more important than it ever has been. The final challenge that we're dealing with our economy is the changing nature of the employment relationship. And recent research by Larry Katz and Alan Kruger has found that if you look at non-standard employment, this is independent contractors, on-call workers, temporary workers, that it's rising quite rapidly from 9% in 1995 to 16% in 2015. The parts of the economy that have gotten the most attention in the press, the sharing economy, is a small portion of this, but is growing, and understanding how we can revise our system as a whole, including unemployment insurance, in light of trends like this is important. At the same time, it's also important that the majority of people are in more traditional standard employment. So we don't want to throw everything out, invent a brand new system, but we do want to make sure it works for this increasing group of people. I want to briefly go through why UI is economically important, and Carmel and Sandy made a number of these points. Traditionally, the two arguments you would hear are, number one, that it provides households with incomes when they need it most. It helps them, in the parlance of economics, smooth their consumption in the face of a shock. And if you look between 2008 and 2012, 11 million people were lifted above the poverty line by unemployment insurance. And the second, which is very closely related to that, is it acts as an automatic stabilizer, reducing recessions. And it does that effectively for two reasons. One is it's automatic. It doesn't require the government to do anything. It doesn't even require the statistical agencies to report on the unemployment rate. When people actually become unemployed, they show up, and this happens automatically. The second is it gives money to people who are temporarily low income, thus most likely to spend it. And both the Congressional Budget Office and research by Alan Auerbach and Dan Feinberg has found that unemployment insurance is among the most effective automatic stabilizers in terms of bang for the buck and in terms of timeliness. In the last decade or so, economic research has added two other reasons why unemployment insurance is so important, and documented the evidence behind them. The first is you only get unemployment insurance if you're looking for work. And so unemployment insurance can actually help keep you attached to the labor force, keep you looking for a job, rather than just giving up and leaving the labor force entirely. And that's really important, because once you give up and leave the labor force entirely, it's even harder to get back into it. And when you look at that trend in labor force participation, this is particularly important. And then the last, which is related to that, is that unemployment provides liquidity, and in turn helps workers find better job matches. You could imagine a world where you punished people for being unemployed, and if you had that world, people probably would find a job very quickly, but the job would be a terrible one for them and for their future earnings. This allows them to find a better one. I want to now talk, though, about some of the downsides and trade-offs, and all programs have downsides and trade-offs. When I was in graduate school, the chart we saw to illustrate the downside of unemployment insurance was this one. And it showed the chance that you left unemployment when your benefits expired. And people would say, look at that. This is actually in the case of Austria, but you see something similar to the United States. Look at that. When your benefits expire, people leave unemployment. So if we just had the benefits expire earlier, they'd leave unemployment earlier, and everything would be better. It turns out economists have taken a harder look at this, and this effect, which is called a moral hazard effect, is one, but then there's these the other effects I was talking about related to liquidity, giving you more money, more flexibility in finding a job. And so the question is, those people who left unemployment, why did they leave unemployment? What were they doing? It turns out it isn't because their benefits were expiring, so now they're going to find a job. It turns out their benefits were expiring, so they no longer say they're unemployed. They no longer say they're looking for jobs, because looking for jobs is what you need to be doing to be unemployed. You look at the odds that people become employed, find employment, those are unrelated to the duration of benefits. So it turns out the things that benefits are doing is it might cause higher measured unemployment, but the majority of that is because people say they're looking for a job, which means they're classified as unemployed, rather than giving up and leaving the workforce entirely. Of course, there is some trade-off at some point, and that's why unemployment insurance benefits replace only a fraction of your earnings and are time-limited. And the right trade-off depends on the situation in the economy, a point I'll come back to. I want to now briefly put on the table 6 shortcomings of the current system that can be strengthened, and these are shortcomings that are very similar to the ones identified in the report we're discussing today, some of which Carmel and Sandy have already talked about. The first is the declining coverage, down to about a quarter of people. This is in part because of changing economic circumstances, but a lot of this is a deliberate choice on the part of states. 9 states have cut the number of weeks below 26 weeks. In North Carolina, it's 13 weeks. And those, as well as tightened eligibility in a larger number of states, and those choices have dramatically reduced the percentage of workers that are covered by unemployment insurance. The second issue, which Sandy talked about, so in terms of the response, the administration's proposal there is to make 26 weeks mandatory and to cover a wider range of workers, including part-time and people who lose their job due to certain pressing circumstances, have to leave their job for certain pressing family circumstances. The second is the insolvency of state programs. We saw 36 states having to take emergency loans in the last recession. And even today, 60% of states don't have enough money in their trust fund to cover a single year of benefits in the recession, which is basically the type of standard you want to look at. And several states continue to be indebted. What we've proposed is to reform the unemployment insurance financing mechanism, which would both make it more efficient and fair, as well as making it better able to deal with solvency. In particular, taking the tax base, which has been frozen at $7,000 for a really long time now, raising it up to $46,000 and indexing that to inflation going forward. At the same time, at the federal level, we'd make that revenue neutral by cutting the federal tax rate, but we would expect a lot of states, which would also have to match the new tax base, to rise up and get additional revenue with it to improve their solvency. The third issue is ineffective counter-cyclical triggers. They're ineffective in 2 senses. One is extended benefits program is 50% federally financed, 50% state financed. The problem is during a recession, states have balanced budget requirements, and they actually tend to cut spending, not increase it. The federal government is in a much better position to borrow in a recession to help counteract it. The second is the way the triggers themselves are designed miss states that, for example, see their unemployment rate rise for a sustained period of time, as happened in the Great Recession. We saw, and Sandy talked about it very painfully, at the end of 2013, UI expired, even though the duration of unemployment was higher than any previous recession. So we've put forward a proposal that would reform the triggers and make them 100% federally financed, and they'd be triggered either by a sustained high period of unemployment or by a large rise in it. Next is incentives to reduce employment, not hours, which is, in general, you get unemployment if you fire someone, not if you take a group of people and reduce their hours. You see Dean Baker and Kevin Hassett from the left and right have proposed this idea. It's something we did in the 2012 unemployment insurance reforms, and something that we're proposing additional support for, both incentives for states that take up short-time compensation, as well as administrative funding in recessions. The fifth issue is insufficient support for job search. In the United States, we spend 0.1% of GDP on so-called active labor market policies to help people find jobs. The OECD average is 0.6% of GDP. We're below every country except Chile or Mexico. We've proposed to provide incentives for states to adopt a variety of different ways that help people search for jobs and get into jobs. And then finally is insufficient insurance against more adverse job prospects. And this is that unemployment insurance helps you if you don't have a job. It doesn't help you if the only job you can find has lower wages, and it doesn't help you. And also, to the degree you're worried about the trade-off I was talking about before, one way to help deal with those trade-offs is to give people more of an incentive to take a new job rather than taking away the support they're getting for UI. And to that end, the President's proposed a wage insurance that would replace up to half the wages you lost for 2 years, capped at $10,000 for jobs making less than $50,000. But would conclude by saying, really looking forward to this conversation. And as I said, it couldn't be more timely. Now is exactly when we should be having it. Thank you.
Going. I'm going to sit on the end.
Are you? Okay.
Thank you both for those terrific presentations. Maybe we could start just talking a little bit about the atmospherics around this issue. As you both know, having been so involved in recent efforts to extend UI and in the past to reauthorize it, it seems like inevitably in those debates there's this stigma around unemployment, but yet we see, as I said at the beginning, so many Americans really experience it at some point in their employment histories. So are there ways you think we can kind of get past that so we could get a conversation where we don't have to be in an emergency situation to really think about how we can strengthen this program and prepare for those recessionary periods as opposed to having to constantly do it in a crisis moment?
Well, I think one way to help do that would be to have discussion of this in the presidential campaign, to elevate it, and to really have an argument over the purpose of unemployment insurance. Jason Furman has laid out, I think so vividly, why unemployment insurance is not, in quote, a welfare program. It's vital for the nation's economy. It's vital to keep people in the workforce. Remember, we argued that endlessly, and we said, if you cut off unemployment insurance, it's likely that a substantial number of people will drop out, and maybe for good. And so we just need to elevate this discussion as part of what this country is really all about, and not leave it to next year.
Do you think, Jason, that's part of it, that people don't appreciate the number of people who are leaving the workforce? And
Yeah, I mean, there's 2.5 million people on UI now, but during the Great Recession and the aftermath, 70 million people, including the workers, their families, including more than 17 million children, benefited from unemployment insurance. So it's something that really affects a lot of people. But what I found in the debate last time is there was really fatigue. By the end of 2013, it was, we've had this for 6 years or 7 years, whatever we'd had it for already. Do we need it for another year? As opposed to saying, you know, Congress originally passed EUC, extended emergency benefits, in 2008 when the unemployment rate was, I think, 5.5%, and the long-term unemployment rate was relatively low. In 2013, the unemployment rate was higher than where it was when we originally had done it. The long-term unemployment rate was a lot higher than where it was. So it wasn't, you know, you shouldn't think of it as you've done it for a certain number of years. You should think of it as, what are the objective economic circumstances? Do they justify it? And if they justified it in 2008 when Congress on a bipartisan basis extended benefits, or 2009 when they did it on a bipartisan basis, then they still did in 2013. But people just got, tired of it, and that's really unfortunate. That's part of why want to make it more automatic, so there is less discretion.
And let me just add, it's very relevant to some of the issues that are being discussed. In its own way, income inequality, also in terms of corporate responsibility. And what's happening in the states is that the states are essentially ducking this issue, in many cases making it worse. And the business world, we need to have a constructive discussion with the world of business about their obligation, because everybody suffers, including the entire structure, when we have kind of close to chaos. As we discussed, I remember going back 20-some years, we talked about these darn triggers in the present structure. They're impossible. They don't work. So I think the importance of today is that it will hopefully project this issue into an honest, constructive discussion of what unemployment insurance, the role it plays in the lives of people and the economic life of this country.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Congressman, the role of states, that obviously creates a lot of the inconsistencies from state to state in terms of benefits, but brings challenges. The fact that it's a federal-state partnership. Do either of you have thoughts about how to think about that moving forward if we were able to think about the program in new and different ways?
I'll be very brief because I could talk about what's happened in Michigan. What the state of Michigan did was to decide they were going to go over to an automatic system. And they were going to even further diminish the role of people handling unemployment insurance claims. So they went off to this automated system, and thousands and thousands of people as a result were said to have received their unemployment insurance fraudulently, when so far it turns out that in the vast majority of cases that wasn't true. And what happened as a result of this kind of blind automatic thought about unemployment insurance, that people who were not at fault at all had their wages garnished and had their income tax returns that they were supposed to receive taken back by the U.S. government. So there are all kinds of reasons for us to take a hard look and for all of us to do this creatively.
Yeah, and the federal government pays a decent fraction of unemployment insurance. It has long been very involved in a set of rules around what you can and can't do within it. Certain things that people just didn't picture. You didn't picture that the state would cut its weeks of benefits to 13 weeks. And in light of that, I think it's really important to take a look at what the set of rules are, what the set of principles that you're operating on, and one of them should be that if you want to be a part of this program, you're going to offer 26 weeks of benefits, and then we'll give you extra in the event that the unemployment rate in your state is high or high on a sustained basis.
And let me just say briefly, if you don't have a federal component, if it's every state on its own, what happens is that there's a race to the bottom, and people then are forced to look for work elsewhere. And it has a very disruptive impact on family life. And we ought to understand that. I said during the recession, for people who thought we shouldn't extend the benefits, just go home and talk to the families of people when you cut the unemployment insurance or it wasn't extended. People, instead of looking for work where their kids were, where their kids were in school, and often where their spouse worked, and you just have to pick up and leave, and what are the consequences?
Is that persuasive for some of them at least?
Right.
Jason, you talked briefly about some of the things the administration has proposed to try to actually prevent job loss and then also to connect unemployment insurance with training opportunities. Can you talk a little bit more about what you've put forward, and Congressman Levin, if you have ideas in terms of that topic as well?
Yeah, and I want to, before doing any specifics, make a little bit of an optimistic point. I mean, you can, doesn't feel like this is going to be legislated in the next week or whatever it is before you go out. But that doesn't mean it won't get done. We did unemployment insurance modernization. When I say we, Nick Gwynn in the back here led a lot of the work. The congressman, obviously very deeply involved. And that was something that had been gestating for a long period of time, and it was gestating with different proposals and reports like this and discussions like the one we're having today. We came back in 2012 and added some things. And so a lot of states have made changes. A lot more states are covering part-time workers. A lot more states have short-time compensation. A lot of them have a number of the things we'd like to see. So part of the spirit of what the president's reform proposal is building on the successes of recent years and making sure we're having the conversation now, not because he thinks it's going to happen right away, but to make sure that when we come back to it, we've laid the foundation. But I think, all of the proposals are very much in the spirit of UI is a great program, and we need to build on it to make it even better, part because of changing circumstances in the economy, but also part because of changing circumstances in public policy. And so that includes, all the things I was talking about before. That, it's an important program, so let's make sure it's solvent. It's an important program, let's make sure more people can get it. It's an important program, make sure it helps you prevent you losing a job, or helps you, if you've lost a job, find a job, or if you can't find the greatest job, helps compensate you for that as well. So broadening the coverage out a little bit in both of those directions.
Let me just urge, in a note of optimism, that I think the conversation has to go on not only among people who have been at odds, but also among those of us who are dedicated, for sure, improving the system. Because there are different ideas. I think, for example, how you relate job training to unemployment insurance. And it's been, I think, 20 years ago when Kitty Higgins, who was then our chief of staff, who had worked in the Labor Department since she was, I think, 18, eventually became Bob Rush's chief of staff when he became Secretary of Labor. We tried to start a conversation about how you really intervene earlier and how you really try to link job retraining and training more effectively. And now there are ideas about people sharing less employment. All these ideas are sometimes difficult, and they sometimes are a bit controversial, even among people who basically agree. We need to have a very forthright conversation, because this system in our country is backwards compared to most countries. I think it remains true, for example, in Canada, when there's a likely layoff, there's much earlier intervention on an organized basis in terms of what's going to happen next for those families, assuring unemployment insurance, but building in a training, retraining program much earlier. Instead, you go into most state unemployment or workforce offices today, And while there used to be a job service with human beings to provide some advice, in many offices, there's almost nobody there.
Definitely something we need to tackle together. Well, we just have a few more minutes, so we have time for a couple questions right here in the front.
This is Mitzi. I'm Mitzi Wertheim, and I think this is with the Naval Postgraduate School, and I think this is an incredibly important question. I think it's incredibly complex. I think on the whole, most folks in this country don't even begin to understand the interdependencies. And my own view is one place where the government is failing us is explaining these processes in terms that a general voter can know what you're talking about. Alan Alda did an amazing thing in explaining complex science to 11-year-olds, because that's the level you have to reach if you want the voter to understand it. I think we end up having metrics that don't work. I mean, the idea that the gross domestic product tells us what the average income is, and when you have 40% of the income in the upper 1% or whatever, people have a sense that the general public is better off than they are. You have to think about all these tiny details, and I would get a whole lot of people engaged in coming up with answers. By the way, I don't understand where the jobs are going to come from. There was a wonderful piece in the Washington Post a few weeks ago. The solution to our carbon problem was to have the federal government buy all the coal mines in West Virginia and not mine them. So I looked up how many miners are there in West Virginia. 183,000. Well, you talk about your uninsurance. If they don't have an income, sort of everything in the state comes to a standstill. So I'm asking you to explain it with all the detailed pieces, and you have to do it visually because it's all interdependent.
Thank you for that question. I know Jason spends a lot of time cutting the numbers in a lot of different ways, and I think you did a terrific job of translating it for dummies like me. but do you have?
By the way, my remarks today, an expanded version of them will be on the Council of Economic Advisors website shortly. And we've certainly worked together. I mean, you I'm sure have done all sorts of floor charts that give you simple, brutal images about how many millions of people are being cut off from benefits or what the consequences will be. So I think, we've certainly made an effort and can continue to.
We try. We'll try harder.
Yeah. I would note that CAP has a paper on using royalties coming from federal resources mined on federal lands to fund training programs for workers to be retrained to be able to do different kinds of jobs. So that's one idea that we have in terms of figuring out how we can prepare people in advance for the next set of jobs. I think we have time for one more question. Person
Take
on
the
the
two right there. There's three.
Tom Timberg, consultant. I heard two interesting things. I wondered if you could. I heard two interesting things that I wondered if each of you could expand on a bit. The first one was bipartisan support. We haven't had so much of that. How much do you conceive that that's feasible? And the second was making this a leading theme in the presidential campaign. And it seems to me that's a very high potential item and might even be connected with bipartisan support. What were you thinking of?
You're right. No, we need to have very direct conversations about what we're discussing here today. And I think what we're going to do is to try to have people tell their stories. I mean, just what this has meant in the lives of people. I think the gentleman in front, maybe we'd close with him.
Okay.
Congressman Levin, you mentioned some kind of glitch in the automatic system in Michigan where some unemployed people had their wages garnished and their tax returns confiscated. Whatever happened with that? Was the problem resolved? Did they get their money back or what? I'm just curious.
The answer is we're working hard at it, and very much so. We had a press conference, to go back to the comment the gentleman behind you made, in Michigan, in Detroit, in front of the state office, of people who had been impacted. And maybe this is a good place to close as you go to the next panel. You know, what motivated us as we tried to extend this program, not endlessly, and we acknowledged there might be some need to cut short the weeks because there was 99 weeks. You know, you could argue about some of those details, but the basic thrust for us was always very clear, and that was, what is this country really all about? And we just need to elevate unemployment insurance issues as part of an honest debate in this country as to what happens in a time of recession. And the notion is that it will all come out in the wash needs to be challenged by those who are the victims of that kind of approach. And so that's what we're doing now with this problem with Michigan. And it's both a federal and a state responsibility because we have this mixed system. And there isn't the suggestion that the federal government take it over entirely, right? We have a blended system in this complicated country. And what we really need to do is to have this debate. So what should the federal role, and I think as Jason has outlined as your report says, there have to be some certain minimums. But then there has to be a state responsibility combined with that. But the states need to step up to it. And instead what they're doing now is ducking their responsibility in many cases. And employers are doing that because they don't want their taxes raised. But in the end, if you have another recession, then everybody gets hurt. And more importantly, in your next panel, I think we'll discuss that, we need to have an honest discussion about how you blend training and retraining with a strong unemployment insurance system. And instead, we've been cutting down monies for retraining in this country. So you talk about disequilibrium, inequalities, though these are vivid examples. And so I think hopefully today we'll project this into the dialogue that we're going to have these next months as we decide who will be president of the United States.
Thank you for that. Jason, any closing thoughts?
No, I think this is a great conversation, and it illustrates the amount of convergence. And to the bipartisan question from before, in 2009, when we raised the number of weeks to 99 weeks in recognition of the economic circumstances, that was passed in the Senate on a 98-0 vote. A number of the reform proposals here set a minimum for states, but some of them also give more flexibility and more tools for states to use too, that many states have been eager for, and you've seen support from both sides of the aisle. So there have been moments like 2013 where it really was a party line debate, and one party wanted to extend benefits and one party prevented that from happening and resulted in millions of people being cut off from them. But it doesn't need to be that way, and it isn't always that way, and having conversations like this today can help build support to really do things about this in the future.
So thank you for having us.
Thank you for your leadership, and we're going to follow your advice, Congressman, because before we get to the next panel, we are going to do some storytelling from someone who's experienced the system firsthand. But first, just ask all the audience to thank our panelists for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Congressman Levin and Chairman Furman, for your leadership on behalf of the American families. We've heard today how UI is nothing short of a lifeline for workers who are laid off through no fault of their own. Yet today, 3 in 4 jobless workers are without this lifeline. No call to strengthen and expand unemployment protections would be complete without a reminder of the very real and painful lived experiences of unemployment for families. Experiences that speak to UI's vital role in boosting economic security, that underscore the urgency of expanding UI to more of the workforce before the next recession, and that demonstrate how valuable similar protections, such as a job seeker's allowance, could be for workers who remain ineligible for UI. To share one such experience, it's my honor to introduce our next speaker, Laquita Hatcher. Laquita comes to us from Jackson, Mississippi, where she and her husband, a full-time IT worker, are raising two daughters. After earning her master's degree, Laquita worked in the health education field for a decade. Last December, Laquita was laid off from her nonprofit job due to budget cuts. UI has been instrumental in helping her family navigate the difficulties of unemployment, which are made more challenging for her family by medical expenses, while allowing her to search for a job that fits her skills and her interests. I'm very pleased to welcome Laquita to share her experience and to speak to the importance of unemployment assistance for her and her family.
Hello. As she stated, growing up in Jackson, Mississippi, the oldest of 5, to an Army father and a full-time working mother, there was a plan for our lives. You go to school, you go to church, and then you get a good job, hopefully a state job, so that you can get benefits and retire. And that was our life plan. And so I followed the plan. I went out to college. I got a degree in psychology and then a master's in human services. And then I returned home to Mississippi, to the place that raised me, to the place that provided me education to work and to raise my family, to be with my husband, and to secure a life for us. And so we settled in, and I settled in. And then in 2012, doctors discovered optic neuritis, which then led to a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. And so then we settled into neurologist visits and to visiting the eye doctor to learn how to care for my vision better, to how to care for my children with optic neuritis, and how to care for my children with multiple sclerosis. And what does that mean when it comes to medical expenses, to our bills, to the medicine that I require? And then we settled in to me working as a health educator, and I was there for 5 years. And then last year, I got the news. I had the meeting that none of us want. They told me, it's not you, it's our budget, and so we will have to let you go. And so then I said, okay, now what happens? What do we do now? How does our family survive on one income? And then we learned that unemployment benefits will be available to us, to our family. So immediately we made the decision to remove our 7-year-old daughter, Ayla, from aftercare. She could be home with me since I would be home looking for a job, and that would alleviate some of the burden of our expenses. And then we made the decision to leave our 2-year-old daughter, Elena, in daycare because we knew how important it was that I had time during the day to look for a job. You can't look for a job with a 2-year-old. And so we made the decision to sacrifice and leave her there. Now, what do we do about insurance? Because they were on my insurance. I had insurance through my job. We made the decision to apply for CHIP, for our daughters, and we were approved. And so now they're covered for insurance because of me receiving unemployment benefits. And then we looked at our budget again, and we said, okay, how can we make this work? How can unemployment sustain us while we're working with one budget? And so we made the decision to pay our mortgage first. That's priority. And all other things, will come next, such as daycare. And we streamlined things in our home, reducing our cell phone bill if possible, applying for my medications that I definitely need through a pharmaceutical company, and they were able to cover them as a result of me being on unemployment and showing them that unemployment doesn't mean that I'm waiting, for a handout. Unemployment means that I am actively seeking work, that I am looking for something new. I don't want to just take a position that matches no interest of mine or provides no addition to the career that I plan to move forward in. This is not the end for me when it comes to unemployment. It is a transition to a different beginning. For 10 years, I worked in the field of public health, and so that was what I was accustomed to, and that was what I knew. For 5 years, they were aware of my MS diagnosis, and so I was comfortable there because if I needed to take a break because of the heat, or if there were things that I'd forgotten because of MS, they understood and they were willing to work with me. And so that was a fear of mine. How can I move forward to a new position if they're not aware? Should I disclose to them? How can I be comfortable in a new place? And how can I be sure that stigma or discriminatory things won't happen if I disclose that I have MS? And so all of that was a part of the stressor of losing my job. But thankfully, unemployment was a place that kept us balanced. It gave us a safety net. It gave us a cushion while I have been able to look for something new, look for something different. It allowed me the ability to keep my daughter at home with me in the afternoons while I was looking for employment during the day. It allowed me the opportunity to work part-time or contract positions to keep experience, to not be unemployed for long stretches of time. Because as we know, if anyone has looked for new employment, that's a big no-no to have a gap in employment. And so it's giving me the luxury, I would say, the flexibility of looking for something new and to be able to move forward in a different career if necessary. And so as I keep moving forward in the progression of my career and allowing my daughters to stay in daycare and in aftercare, hopefully in the future, I am grateful for unemployment and for what it's giving to our family and for providing what could have been a catastrophic event. It has allowed us to stay in our home. It has allowed us to not lose our lights or our cell phones, which we need to be contacted for a new phone. We qualify for Women and Infant and Children's Program, which provides a monthly meal benefit as a result of our 2-year-old daughter and being unemployed. And it just has given us a safety net that we may not have had as a result of me being laid off. And I'm grateful for that because it keeps the stress that being unemployed would otherwise result in. And many of us go through our day-to-day lives being stressed, and so you know what that's like. And if you live with a disease where they say, don't be stressed, it exacerbates things for you. How do you deal with that when you're being told that you're unemployed, or if you have a 7-year-old daughter who worries that, are we going to run out of money? And this is something that she said to me. And so being able to say to her, no, we're not going to run out of money. We're still going to do, fun things, or making life comfortable and happy for her has been a result of me receiving unemployment. And I am grateful for that. Never in my life did I think I would be in a place where I would share my story of unemployment. I always thought that I would work. I always thought that I would follow the line of going to church, going to school, and getting a job. But even in this place, I am still going to church. And if need be, then I'll go back to school because I have the cushion of unemployment and I will be back out in the market force. So I'm grateful for it, and I'm also grateful for the opportunity to share my story, which is many other people's story. So thank you.
Start off by thanking Laquita for sharing her story. I think it provides the grounding for the conversation that we're about to have. We sort of talked about the economics of the program and from a policy perspective why it's important. We've heard about the personal and the human story behind why it's so important. And I'm really excited to have such a distinguished panel with us today to talk about both policy solutions and how we can get from where we are today to a point where we have a strengthened and more modern unemployment insurance system. So I'm going to quickly introduce our panel and then kick it off. Immediately to my right is Valerie Wilson, who is the director of the program on race, ethnicity, and the economy at the Economic Policy Institute. It's a nationally recognized source for expert reports and policy analysis on the economic condition of America's people of color. To her right is Claire McKenna, who's a senior policy analyst at NELP, a national expert on unemployment insurance, and a co-author on the report. To her right is Indavar Dattagupta, who's a senior fellow at the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. Also spent time as professional staff on Ways and Means and was a driving force behind some of the UI modernization efforts discussed earlier and a co-author on the report. And then finally, last but certainly not least, is Portia Wu, who was sworn in as Assistant Secretary of Labor for the Employment and Training in April 2014 and leads the Employment and Training Administration, which is the agency which actually administers and oversees UI, so very relevant to today's conversations. So I want to kick it off actually starting at the middle of our panel to Claire and Indy. We've heard a lot today about sort of the broad themes of reemployment and basic standards, the next recession, et cetera. I was wondering if the two of you could quickly cover an overview of what is in the report we're discussing today with policy recommendations along those lines for us to react to and discuss.
Sure. So just to review quickly, unemployment insurance is a federal-state partnership. Current federal law grants states a lot of flexibility in key program areas of benefit eligibility, benefit adequacy, and financing. And the result really is very significant state variation in key program metrics. For example, rates of recipiency, which is the share of a state's unemployed population that receives unemployment insurance benefits, rates of income replacement, which vary significantly, and of course, trust fund solvency, the financial health of a state's program. And Jason reviewed some of the various ways that states are currently falling short in these areas. So our proposal really advocates a much stronger federal role in the federal-state partnership by recommending a series of new, broader federal program standards in key program areas. We're at a point in the program's history, at a critical point where we can really no longer expect states to do the right thing and to maintain properly financed, adequate unemployment insurance programs. So our proposal makes recommendations to modernize unemployment insurance in sort of three broad categories. And the first category of recommendations would expand access significantly to effective in-person reemployment services through our nationwide network of American Job Centers. And it would expand job retention measures, especially a program called work sharing, which has been referred to earlier. Work sharing is a type of unemployment insurance program that allows businesses to preserve jobs during economic slowdowns by reducing the job schedules of employees in place of layoffs. And then those employees get partial unemployment insurance benefits until normal business conditions resume. And it's proven very effective across the world, but it's just never been used as extensively in the United States, unfortunately. Our second set of recommendations are really are focused around expanding benefit eligibility and strengthening benefit adequacy. And a number of the recommendations really should be familiar to the folks in this room, but we probably go a little bit further in this area of recommendations than, say, the administration's very strong UI reform proposal and even the Recovery Act legislation of 2009. And so our proposal, for example, recommends establishing a monetary eligibility standard that would apply across states. Of course, extending eligibility to part-time workers. Part-time work plays a very significant role in the U.S. labor market, as well as just expanding eligibility to a variety of other workers and non-standard employment arrangements. So I'll turn to my co-author to describe the rest of the proposal.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Melissa. I'm actually going to just touch on the job seekers allowance, which is a somewhat new idea here, although one that's found in many other wealthy countries, including especially the United Kingdom, which we think is a very important complement to the unemployment insurance proposal that we've laid out. So first of all, we tried with the unemployment insurance proposal to expand the program in ways that we thought were defensible based on the research, and that also held to some of the core aspects of the program. So first of all, that it's still a contributory program, and then secondly, that it even as it serves many other purposes, some of which I'll try to discuss later, and we've already heard from, that it stays core to ensuring against recent loss of earnings from either a loss of employment or, in the case of work-sharing programs, a reduction of hours. So that means that even the most robust unemployment insurance system isn't going to reach every unemployed worker. And that's especially true in the case of new entrants into the labor force and also re-entrants in some cases, so people who may have taken some time out for various reasons. And so we've proposed a job seekers allowance that would essentially pay a modest benefit, roughly half of an unemployment insurance weekly benefit on average, and only for about half as long, about 3 months in most cases, for, again, people who are actively seeking work. So who might this new program particularly help? And some of the beneficiaries are obvious, but some are less so. One group that we think is often left out and would be left out of any UI system by and large is young people. And as many of you know, we have a real crisis in this country with youth employment, with over 5 million young people, young adults and teenagers who are out of work and out of school. Just to give you a sense of this, so the teen unemployment rate in the most recent month is 16%, but among African American teens, the data, admittedly somewhat noisy, was over 30%. That means they're actively seeking work and unable to find it. And even in months before that, the rate was quite high. And then you think about people who might take some time out of the workforce. So people will, we think, increasingly be taking time out of the workforce, for example, for caregiving responsibilities with an aging population, but also responsibilities for children and themselves in some cases. And while we certainly need programs like paid leave to help people fulfill these duties, we also need to take it seriously, as you've heard when Laquita is saying, it's a full-time job to look for work, and typically you don't get child care assistance. And a job seekers allowance would be a modest benefit that would help acknowledge what we're really telling people but not living up to on our end as a country. And then you also think about groups like the reentry population. We still have several 100,000 people leaving jails and prisons every year in the U.S., and by and large, they're not going to be eligible for much assistance right when they come out. And so this could be a core part of a reentry strategy. But more broadly, as we think about some of the economic trends and the working and middle class, and to be sure, the job seekers allowance reaches up to the Social Security taxable wage base, which currently is over $100,000 a year. So this is really a benefit for a wide swath of American workers. This is the sort of benefit that we think can help fill a hole as people are in non-standard working arrangements. And again, I want to reiterate that's some cases that's not legitimate, and that is something that we acknowledge in the report and not to be addressed. If workers are misclassified, they're misclassified. But there are legitimately classified workers who are not employees, and this would help with that. And it could be a complement to broader portable benefits proposals as well. The final thing I just want to mention is, while while this benefit is clearly for a wide swath of the working and middle class, the reality is for especially those at the very bottom, we have gutted our safety net in many ways. And this is one way to engage in what Jason referred to as active labor market policy. So what we know is that people, by and large, really want to work. And this is an important tool that can help us get them there, whether or not there's a recession.
Thank you, Claire and Indy. So now, Portia and Valerie, I want to really invite you to react. You are nationally renowned experts on unemployment insurance, on reemployment training and the economy. I want to invite your comments both on the proposal itself as well as some of the broader trends and needs in the unemployment insurance system. So maybe, Valerie, I'll start with you.
Sure, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this very important discussion on unemployment insurance. I agree with what everyone else has said so far, that we don't continue this discussion enough, so I'm glad to see it today. And I also want to say that I think that the report and the proposal touch on a lot of important issues that tend to get swept aside or overlooked or not be as urgent as the discussions we're having when we need emergency benefits. But the whole idea of really strengthening and modernizing and expanding the system is critical. It's critical for a number of reasons. We've already talked a bit about how women and people of color are disproportionately in the types of jobs that historically have not been covered by unemployment insurance. But along with that, we know that our workforce is growing increasingly diverse. We've talked about rising women's labor force participation, but also just the demographics of the country are changing. So when we see that in 2015, only 1 in 4 unemployed workers were receiving benefits, well, that has a lot to do with what the population looks like now and what the nature of the workforce is. But I think another important point that you've made in talking about strengthening the federal component of the system is the fact that there's a lot of state variation. And that state variation, unfortunately, is not random. It doesn't have a random effect. Many of the states that did not adopt the modernization changes, that cut their employment duration or tightened eligibility, were states disproportionately in the southern region of the United States. That's significant because over 60% of African American workers live in these southern states. So when those kinds of changes are made to the system, they have a disproportionate effect on African Americans in particular, but other workers, all workers who live in those states. So I think the components of the proposal that really try to address what happens with that state variation is relevant. The cost of living varies across states. States have different budgets, but that shouldn't result in segments of the population really being hurt more drastically when we have an economic downturn. I think the other part of that that's critical is this piece on reemployment services. Because when you're out of a job, if you live in a community where many of your neighbors are out of a job, how do you sort of get reconnected to the system, since many jobs are identified and secured by people that we know or references that we can get. So I think having something that's systematic like that, where there's a place that people can go and get the new training if they need new training, get information about what employment opportunities are available and where they're available, and other services that are critical to doing that are important as well. I think that we've already talked about extending benefits to people who are in non-standard work arrangements. That just goes with, again, trends in the workforce. And then finally, I was really excited to see this piece about the job seekers allowance, because that's really pushing the envelope and really getting to something that hasn't been talked about a lot, but needs to be talked about a lot. Because when we look at younger workers and new entrants to the workforce, those who were finishing school in 2007, 8, 9, 10, on even now, it was just really bad timing that they enter the workforce in the time when we were having one of the worst economic downturns in our history. And that's no fault of their own. They were doing what they were supposed to do. Laquita talked about it earlier. The plan for having a stable, successful life is you go to church, you go to school, and you get a job. But if you get out of school, whether it's high school or college, at a time when we're losing 800,000 jobs a month, what do? You still have bills, you still have expenses. Your parents may not be in the best economic situation either. So I think that something like a job seeker's allowance is critical, especially for those downturn moments, but also just in any economy. Again, when we look at demographic differences, the black unemployment rate is typically twice the white unemployment rate. And it's high because those are people who are looking for work. It's not, people who don't want to, make any effort to get a job. It's high because there's a lot of people looking for work who aren't finding jobs. So I think providing some economic support that, sort of helps to stabilize incomes and earnings during those periods are essential, especially for new entrants.
Thank you, Valerie. Portia, I want to turn it over to you. Thanks, Lisa, and thanks for including me in this discussion. I think, reaction is, as Jason talked about earlier, the administration has a proposal to strengthen and modernize unemployment insurance, and I think there are a lot of similarities that were highlighted in our proposal in this report, and as Congressman Levin said, it's really just important that we're having this debate right now. For those of us in the D.C. area who normally take Metro, I think we all recognize the downsides to sort of ongoing neglect, and let's not wait till we're in a smoke and fire situation to take action on UI. So this is really the time. We've got a growing economy. We have had a chance to catch our breath a little bit. We really need to be looking at proposals, and we have ideas. This report puts forward a lot of great ideas, but as many of the speakers today have emphasized, this has to be a broader conversation. It's got to have state government. It's got to have diverse stakeholders. It's got to have business and everyone at the table to really think about how we not only strengthen but also modernize the system. And one other theme I will touch on that I was really excited to hear about, because at the Employment and Training Administration we deal with not only unemployment insurance but also with job training and employment services. I really heard and have been hearing out in the world more bringing together than ever before of these two worlds, and that really makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think the way we need to talk about unemployment insurance, it's not just an important economic stabilizer and supporting families through a shock and making it, a shock as opposed to a catastrophe in the course of their lives, but it's also about the skills match in our economy. It's making sure that people have the time to look for the job that's the best fit. If you have a master's degree in computer programming or something, but you can't find a job because of a downturn, we don't want you flipping burgers. Then your skills are wasted, plus someone else needed that job, and they could have used that job and built to a different career in a different way. So really having a good skills match, and I think, the themes we're seeing in the report and the administration's proposal of adequate funding to the states to actually run the system, basic number of weeks of benefits to ensure that people have the time and sufficient funds to look for work, and also having these strong supports to make those really good connections, to make sure that skills are matched appropriately to jobs. That's the most efficient outcome for our economy and the best outcome for individuals and their families too. Great. So one other question I have is that we've talked a lot today about the federal-state partnership and the federal-state roles. And I think everyone has acknowledged the need for stronger federal standards to ensure less discrepancies across state, particularly in ways that exacerbate racial, ethnic, and gender disparities. One of the things our report does is, in addition to setting these standards, it also provides additional resources to states that would strengthen their state economy and their ability to meet these new standards. So can you speak a little bit about the recommendations that our report makes, that the administration makes, and the importance of resources to states in meeting the new federal standards that we're laying out in today's report?
I think I do think it is the responsibility of the federal government to ensure that states have enough funds to properly administer their programs. There's really no excuse for claimants, receiving their payments late, for not being able to properly file an appeal, to having, serious challenges navigating new claims filing technologies, which many states are currently implementing. So our proposal, does advocate significantly increasing federal administrative funding for UI programs in states. And it also, I'm encouraged by the fact that the Department of Labor was able to secure additional funding for reemployment services and eligibility assessments in its 2016 budget. But, I think that in order to really meet the needs of our labor market, the reemployment needs of our labor market, we really should, increase funding sort of for reemployment services for UI claimants by many times, and even also increase funding for just reemployment services for the larger universe of job seekers who use the employment service. So,
from 2007 to 2010, if you had asked me how much I thought the role should change between the federal and state governments in this partnership, I would have said maybe not much. And what we've seen, Valerie touched on the enormous variation now that's really unjustified based on local economic conditions or cost of living. And what we've seen in the proven shortcomings of states in their ability to what's called forward finance. They're supposed to build up trust fund reserves in their unemployment insurance accounts during expansion so that they can draw down during recessions. Just makes it quite clear that this proposal, I think the administration's proposal, is responding to real facts on the ground. At the end of the day, the reason for striking the right balance between the federal and state governments is to deliver the best program for workers that we can. And that balance may have to change over time. And what we find in our report is that there's a strong need for the federal government, both because of its ability to play a unique stabilizing effect. It can borrow in a way that others can't. It can also respond to local or regional conditions when the economy, for example, in Michigan, was frankly in a recession for years before the Great Recession hit. In particular, when you see that states are unfortunately taking short-sighted measures and not appreciating some of the wide and longer-term benefits that we've laid out for these programs, the federal government just has to play a stronger role. We know that itself is an uphill fight, but the reality is if you're expecting the states to fix this without very strong measures from the federal government, I think we're going to be waiting far too long for far too many families.
So I want to wrap up with a question that's posed to all of you on the panel, and hopefully takes us in a more hopeful direction, which is how do we build the political and public will for these changes? You know, we're at a moment now where there's increased economic uncertainty, even though we are in an economic expansion, where we've seen the intersections with unemployment insurance and a whole host of issues that are picking up momentum in states and cities across the country. Can you each offer your own reflections on how we translate the proposals, both in this report, but also for strengthening unemployment protections more broadly, such as in the administration's proposal, into action and into momentum for policy change in the coming years?
I'll start. Well, as the shortest short-timer, I think, on this, Secretary Perez often says there are 194 days till the weekend for us in the administration. But first of all, those are the political appointees. The career folks will still be there. The Department of Labor will still have responsibility for working with the states, supporting them as they administer their programs. And I think that, every long journey starts with a step, right? And there are some really big steps that have been taken here. As Jason Furman alluded to, I think UI modernization probably took us about 10 years to get passed into law. Many of us worked on that and held the baton at different phases in that long run. And I think reports like this are incredibly important. Conversations in the political arena are important. Research is incredibly important. I think one of the benefits of the Great Recession, although it was tragic that as many millions of families had to rely on unemployment insurance as had to, but it did its job and it really worked. And now we have a wealth of information to see what happened, who was on UI, what happened, how did extended benefits help them or not. How are things changing now in states that are cutting back on benefits? So I think it's a really important time to be having the conversation not only at a sort of political level, bringing in the skills economy and skills gap issues, talking about what we know from our experience, and also someone referred to the gig economy. I think that's incredibly important, but I will note gigging is how a lot of people who have regular employment or traditional employment manage their risk. Unemployment insurance system is a system to manage that kind of economic risk for families, and it works. It's in place for everyone. Not everyone can access a gig opportunity. So I think it's really something we need to think about how to bring into the next economic era.
I think that's terrific, Portia. And let me just add, I think one of the things that was striking to me today is I don't even know if I, having worked on this program for over a decade, fully appreciated all the benefits of UI. We know the costs. So there's obviously costs with taxes. It could potentially modestly increase the duration that people are unemployed. But I just want to run through some of the benefits that I think we need to do a better job communicating, frankly. So, of course, and these are throughout the business cycle. I mean, this is not just during a recession, but even during expansion. So you saw it could potentially help with the labor force participation problem, where a shrinking share of our population is in the labor force, working or looking for work. It helps with liquidity constraints. What does that mean? That means, so we have, according to Federal Reserve data, almost half of all families are unable to come up with $400 without borrowing or selling something in an emergency. So unemployment insurance, when job loss or earnings loss hits, can be there to help people overcome that. It improves skills and job quality, right? So Portia just mentioned this, Laquita mentioned the same, how it can help people match their talents with the right employment opportunities. Obviously, it can help with stimulus, and that's not just during a recession. There are communities that are hit hard, and unemployment insurance is fundamentally, at its nature, targeted. It goes to people who have lost their job through no fault of their own. So it is targeted whether we have an expansion or a recession. It can help prevent layoffs, and layoffs themselves are quite harmful to workers themselves. We know that it can harm their mental health, their physical health, to their kids in some cases too, and it can prevent layoffs. It can reduce foreclosures. 1.4 million foreclosures reduced during the financial crisis. And also things like disaster response. Unemployment insurance can be a major response when there's disasters, which unfortunately we can expect more of, obviously, with climate change. And then finally, I just want to say it can strengthen families. And if you didn't get that from Laquita's story, I don't know how else to make it more compelling. But fundamentally, it can help people when they're escaping domestic violence and they need to separate from work. They need to follow a spouse to move. They have caregiving responsibilities or illnesses. And this program that delivers all these benefits is not some small magical program. It does this on a massive scale. So I think communicating that clearly is helpful. And then finally, broadly, I think situating this in the politics of economic instability, which as we see, I think is a political threat too. And then also finally just emphasizing, and again, I think Laquita's story did a great job bringing this up, that security and opportunity often go hand in hand and they're not in tension with each other.
I do want to echo Portia's point just about all of the really excellent research, academic research that came out over the Great Recession to show that unemployment insurance, keeps workers engaged in a really active search for work. I think that's just such an important point to really just make, as much as we can. I guess from my perspective, it seems like it would be important to just think about how we especially engage the employer community. They play, from my perspective, a pretty kind of outsized role in state legislatures, especially obviously where much of UI policymaking occurs. So if we could try to engage partners in that community, I think that would obviously help all of us. And also just trying to engage our labor partners who also interact with the employer community, I think on a regular basis, trying to make a really strong case to them that unemployment insurance, is a really important program. It affects their members, and it's something that they should really care about.
All right. So my co-panelists have already made a lot of excellent points, so I'll try to just summarize here at the end. But I think really what all of this comes down to is messaging. I think in order to move this issue forward, we have to first win the messaging battle. And that requires getting it out of this whole discussion of a welfare program, as the term was used earlier, or people not putting forth an effort to work or just living off employment insurance instead of finding a job, which is absolutely ridiculous because you get just a fraction of what you earned when you were working, and you have to be looking for work to get it. To really moving beyond that to talking about how we can strengthen the system, the benefits of the system. I think we've made some progress in that. I mean, we're here today talking about strengthening and expanding UI as opposed to please don't cut it, which was what the conversation was just a few years ago. So I think there is some, gradual momentum in that area, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done on the messaging end of it and getting the story out and the news out about all the benefits of UI. I think also the fact that we've just come through, the Great Recession and have been in this, slow but plodding recovery for a number of years, I think there's a greater willingness or ability for people to identify with the need for that. Much like we're seeing with the whole national discussion on inequality. People kind of see, I'm a part of that, the whole 99 versus 1%. That includes, many more of us. And I think, some of the events that have happened over the last several years have sort of opened people's ears or consciousness to the importance of things like unemployment insurance and other aspects of our social safety net as well.
Well, thank you to this amazing panel. I'm especially excited we got to have this conversation not a week after UI has expired and we're scrambling to do an extension, but when we actually have time to think about how do we strengthen, how do we modernize the system to help more workers, more families, and the economy overall. So I think we're at a moment where we can really begin to build off these great recommendations to build the political and public will to get there. And please join me in thanking these amazing panelists. And please come up afterwards if you have questions.